Then 15, we had a question about merit goods, both variants, and 14 also, we had a question about public goods. So one thing for sure that a lot of our discussion basically has to focus on merit goods, demerit goods, public goods. That understanding has to be really solid about our sort of subjects, okay? So let's start off and discuss from June 14 variant 1. When you look at June 14 variant 1, the question that we're looking at, the first one is that explain the difference between private goods and public goods, and why is it possible for business to make a profit in the supply of private goods but not in the supply of public goods. When we're doing this question, we need to first basically look at what's the difference between public and private good. So basically what distinguish between public and private good in terms of its features, and then we talk about basically why firms can make profits in private goods but not in public goods. So this is the big sort of outline that we want to sort of talk about this. So let's quickly move on. You got to stop me if you feel that the pace is too fast, okay? So are we good to move on? The fact that when you look at private versus public good, the thing that basically defines them is the idea of rival and excludable. Okay, what is rivalry versus excludability? Rivalry basically means consumption by one person will leave less for another. So that's one thing. While excludable is basically it is easy to exclude payers from non-payers. Are you all with me? And both rival and excludable, if a good is both rival and excludable, that good which is both rival and excludable, that becomes what we call a private good. I know I can give an example. For example, chocolate bar. A chocolate bar will be rival because consumption by one person will leave less for another. A chocolate bar is also excludable because whoever buys it will get the right to consume that good. Nobody else can take that right away. You can give up your right. Maine kharidi chocolate, I can give it to you, but the right to give up is also my right. Okay, so it's both rival and excludable. But when you look at a public good on the other hand is non-rival plus non-excludable. Now, one thing you need to understand this, guys, this is important to understand that in order to get yourself your A or A star, basically what you need to remember is that you need to give example. You need to give that application, otherwise you will not get your high marks in your first part. First part, you got to give example. So here you can choose a public good, for example, street light. Okay, when you look at street light is basically non-rival because once provided, any number of people can consume it and quantity won't decrease. That's the fact that it is non-rival. And non-excludable part is simply the idea that once provided, we can't exclude payers from non-payers. Okay, so that's the idea. This is where then we will introduce the concept of free rider problem. we'll say that there is a free rider problem that happens because of the fact that the good is non-excludable. The non-excludable free rider problem basically is the idea that because we cannot exclude, let me write this. What, sorry, non-rival? Once provided, we can't exclude payers from non-payers. Let me just zoom this. Once it's provided, we can't exclude payers from non-payers. And free rider problem is this, that because we cannot exclude, there will be a problem of people not willing to pay for them. Okay? Because people are not willing to pay for them, there will be this issue. When you look at from a private firm's perspective, let me write this. Private firms will therefore not find it profitable to supply public goods as no one is willing to pay for them. Sorry, somebody. Sorry. Okay, so are you with me? So private firms will therefore not find it profitable to supply public goods as no one is willing to pay for them. Right? And on the other hand, what's the thing with private goods? With private goods, there is no problem in terms of non-rivalry and non-excludability. There's a third feature that is also mentioned sometimes in the case of public goods, which is non-rejectability, which is not an important feature, to be honest, which is basically simply once provided, we can't reject it. For example, if I don't want a street light in front of my house, let's say it's annoying, the light is too much, can I reject it? And the answer is no, I can't reject it. Can I reject a private good from consuming it? And the answer is yes, because I'm the one who's buying it, so I can totally reject it. Are you all with me? So let me just recap for all the people who've just joined us. We are looking at the first question, which is basically asking us to talk about the difference between the private good and public good, and why is it possible for business to make profits in the supply of private goods but not in the supply of public goods. And we said this, that there is first we talk about the difference between private and public goods in terms of defined rivalry and excludability, and give example of why private good is rival and excludable, for example chocolate bar, and how street light could be an example of a good which is a public good because it's non-rival and non-excludable. And then we talk about the idea that the reason why firms can make profits in private goods but not in public goods is the idea that there is what we call a free rider problem. A free rider problem is a problem where, because we cannot exclude those who pay from those who cannot pay, the idea is that those no one will want to pay for this. And we say this, that in the case of public goods, there is no price and therefore no demand for the good. What makes the demand effective demand? So basically willingness and ability. So you might have the ability, you may not have the willingness, so you won't ever buy that good. So what happens therefore is that the government may then assume production of these goods as it is a market failure. We say it's a market failure where the market has failed to provide us this good because of the fact that there is what we call a free rider problem happening. I'm going to go now and look for on this page, before we move on to 14.3a, I just want to show you any other question that can make sense here. So let's now go and look at June 15th. I'm jumping because I want to talk about this question as well. Using example, explain the difference between merit goods and public goods and show why is it possible for profit to be made in the supply of one of these goods and not the other. So the question is a little different because now they've put in merit goods, and that's an important thing to understand. merit goods, let's just define them. But the second part of the question is the same. Public goods are what? Non-rival, non-excludable. Because of the free rider problem, there will be a profitability issue, and that's why people won't be able to make profit from it. So supply from private firms will not happen. ये बात तो sorted है, is that sorted? But let's look at merit goods. Now, what are merit goods? Basically, merit goods, we say, merit goods are, an important thing to understand, are private goods. They are private goods, which means they are both rival and excludable. You need to understand this, guys, because a lot of times we just assume that because they are merit, they might not be private. They are private. Example of merit good could be education, could be healthcare. The reason why they are not they are different from other private goods is because the feature they have is basically two features they have, which you need to understand. Number one, there is a positive externality. And number two, there is an information failure. That is where they become slightly different from public goods, because there is an issue that will make it also a market failure. But remember this, all merit goods, all demerit goods are private goods. They are rival, which means consumption by one person will leave less for another. Education example लें, एक बच्चा यहाँ पे एक सीट पे बैठेगा, less of it will be available. If so one guy takes a seat in a classroom, less of it will be available for somebody else. A. B. Those who pay those who pay the fee will get to study the class, for example. Sometimes people can confuse. They say, like for example, if a country has free education, does it still make it a merit good and a private good? And the answer is yes. Because somebody else is paying for it doesn't mean it's not a private good. For example, public schooling is still a private good given to public for free by the government. Is it rival? Yes. One kid will go to that classroom, less of it is available for other people. Is it excludable? Yes. If government decides not to give education to, let's say, one part of the society, they can do so whenever they want to. Make sense? The fact that it's free doesn't make it a private good. The fact that it's rival and excludable makes it a private good, and that's what is the case with merit goods. So, what is the positive externality? Positive externality means basically benefit confer to both individual plus society. And you can give example of, for example, healthcare example could be one, or education could be your education not only result in you to earn more income, but your education also benefit others in terms of higher productivity, better decision making, and so on and so forth. Okay, so give example of how better education can result in productivity to rise, tax revenue can also go up because the incomes rises. You could also talk about how society has better sort of decision making than in society which has less education, and so on and so forth. So all of these are benefits that happens to society. How does the individual benefit? Individual benefit in terms of higher income and higher productivity. So employability may go up, and so on and so forth. What about the information failure? Where is the information failure? Information failure basically means that the individual may not have the right information. Why doesn't he have the right information? Because the benefit may happen later, but the cost is incurred today. Today you are studying here hoping you will get an A, right? But can I guarantee it? And the answer is maybe not, right? Knowing this, that you cannot have ultimately quick return out of this, you may decide not to study. On the 14th, you'll be like, on the 13th, in fact, 14th was gone. 13th night, you'll be like, I don't really care about my grade. I don't know whether studying tonight will help me tomorrow or not. And therefore, you may decide not to study too much. Make sense? It has happened with me a lot in the past where I decided before exam, you know what, I'm not going to study. So what happens basically is, as a result of this, if I look at the demand and supply for education, if it's Q naught, but from society's perspective, because people lack information and because it has a positive externality, demand should be here. Demand should be more. So we say in the case of merit goods, demand in society is much less than what it should be. As a result, the quantity should be more, but quantity is actually only Q naught. Therefore, the socially desirable quantity is D dash. Socially desirable quantity. But what is the quantity that people are consuming? The answer is D naught. So there is what we call, in this case, there is an under provision. Now there's a conclusion that you have to make here, but before I make that conclusion, I want to go back quickly to the question. But before I also go back to the question, is there any question about this stuff that we just did? So basically, what is the common point basically between public and merit goods? Both these goods are examples of market failure. One has no provision, which is your public good, and another one has under provision, shabash. Under provision, which means basically your merit goods. And the reason is simply, for merit goods case, it's a genuine case of people lacking information. It's a genuine case of not understanding that your consumption can benefit others as well. That's why you don't care about the society's benefit and so on. So in the case of merit goods, it's profitable because still a private good. Although there is an under provision, but still a private good, and therefore you can still make profits. And examples are hospitals, private hospitals making money, private schools making money. All of these examples are that they are making money because there is still profits to be made, right? But there is under provision. There should be more private schools, or there should be more schools out there so that it becomes easier for everyone to demand these goods. Number one. Number two, public goods are basically non-rival, non-excludable, and therefore no profit because of the free rider problem. You got to write free rider problem in your answer for examiner to give you marks. You got to talk about rivalry and excludability and so on. Okay, discuss why merit goods are undersupplied in a free market economy and consider the effectiveness of to deal with this problem. Now, हमने अपने पहले वाले part में, in the first part, we've discussed this part. Are you all with me? And that's why this is B here. Because the examiner in the first part, because that's an 8-mark question, the examiner only wants you to mention the fact that merit goods are basically rival and excludable. The fact that they are undersupplied is a next part. Are you all with me? This is basically, here you talk about the fact that they are undersupplied. Why are they undersupplied? Because of information failure plus externality. And then you show the diagram as well. So this is where you get the 12-mark question marks, because you're talking about why they are undersupplied in a free market economy and consider the effectiveness of one policy to deal with this problem. When they say one policy to deal with this problem, then you can talk about the policies that are working. Are we going to move on? Does that make sense? B part? So in the first A part, all you're talking about rivalry and excludability of merit goods. You're not talking about why they are undersupplied. B part, you talk about why they are undersupplied, which we've just discussed information. Otherwise, there is a lot to write in the first part. Make sense? So this is just the same question as the other one, but B part is what we discuss about the why are they undersupplied. Okay, what are the ways that we can fix this problem? The first way, we need to define free market economy. Free market economy simply is an economy where market forces of demand and supply will allocate resources. That's all. That's all you need to say. Don't get into the idea of what is free market economy and so on. Okay, how do we fix the problem? A, through subsidies. And B, you can talk about, or 1 or 2, you can talk about information dissemination. Dissemination की spelling क्या होती है? How do you DISS? Dissemination. Information, basically awareness, spreading awareness about it. Spreading awareness. I want to show you subsidies, and let's talk about subsidies, pros and cons. Okay, subsidies, basically, if I want to give a subsidy here, how do I give a subsidy? I give a subsidy making sure quantity becomes Q1. So guys, how much subsidy should I give? And the answer is, my subsidy should be such that my new quantity becomes this one. Are you all with me? So my new quantity, my subsidy will result in my supply curve to shift to the right. It results in, on my existing demand curve, I make it affordable for people to start buying. So Q1 become my new quantity. So you will show this diagram, and then you will draw a diagram where you are giving a subsidy. Okay, so that's one thing. What are the pros and cons of subsidies? What I'm going to discuss now. But are we happy with subsidy? Yeah. What's the big advantage of subsidy? The big advantage of subsidy is A. Are we happy with how we give subsidy? Am I going to move on? Okay. What are the advantages? Number one, it makes it affordable. Isn't that true? Number two, it uses market forces of demand and supply. What do we mean by this? Why is it advantage? For example, if I don't use subsidy, let's say I put a regulation. Everyone has to go to school, for example. Rather than that, all I did was make it cheaper. People are automatically sending their kids. People want to send their kids, just make it cheaper. Look at this. I just made it cheaper. Automatically on my existing demand curve, people are now buying the good which is socially desirable. So it uses market forces of demand supply. Any other advantage? It makes it affordable for people, which means the rich and the poor all can now send their kids to schools. It uses market forces of demand supply. And number three, any other advantage that we have? It could be, very good. It could be cheaper. Very good point. Then direct provision. Direct provision होता है कि the government decides to provide the good themselves to everyone, then everyone needs to be, so a lot of money will be spent. So it's cheaper than direct provision, it uses market forces demand supply, and it's affordable. That's three is good enough. What about disadvantages? Shabash. The disadvantages would be, number one is always remember it's still like it's expensive, as now we need to basically raise tax revenue to provide this subsidy. Number two would be there is an opportunity cost in terms of more money spent on education means less money elsewhere, and is it worthwhile or not? Number three is this that sorry? In what? That the producers may not transfer the benefit sometimes. But the more important point that I feel sometimes that happens in subsidies is number four is just that government may not know how much subsidy to give, as it is difficult to find the monetary value of externality. What do we mean by this, guys? Basically, I showed you a diagram as to this should be the demand. But do we know exactly how much demand will be in reality? And the answer is we don't know. Which means we don't know how much subsidy to give. We may end up subsidizing too much or too little, both of which is not efficient to start off with. So government may not know the size of the externality. They may under or over subsidize the good, which could be a problem. So that's a great answer. The way I conclude this 12 marks wala question, 12 mark questions, the way I'm going to conclude this is that because of merit goods because merit goods have two kind of a problem. Number one is positive externality. Number two is information failure. It is always beneficial to, so let me write this conclusion. So the conclusion will be always beneficial for people to know the benefit of public goods, benefit of merit goods in order to demand the right quantity. Like in the case of polio vaccination is a private good which is given to people. In Pakistan, people have a misconception about it. They're not giving their children polio vaccination. It's a case of merit good. If you really want people to start demanding the right quantity, you just need to educate them about the benefits of the good, and automatically people will demand that good. The government may no need to worry about under consumption of it. Yes, you make it affordable, but demand wise you won't have a problem because people truly know the benefit of the good. Does that make sense? So that's an answer for this question. Okay, the next thing we want to look at is basically, so we started with this one. Now I want to move on to, since we just discussed the merit goods, let's talk about the demerit goods and quickly wrap this question as well. Explain what economists mean when they describe a good as demerit good, and using diagrams show why such good will be overconsumed in a free market. So it's a good question to do right now, just right after merit goods. Discuss any two policies that might be used to deal with the problems caused by consumption of demerit goods and consider which might be more effective. Again, so I'm going to talk about the first part, but one important principle to remember: when you are answering a question that you feel is one that you have to do, you got to plan both the answer parts before you write the answer parts. Like अगर आप A लिखने वाले हैं, if you're about to write A, please have a plan for B ready as well. Don't just see A and start writing, because you might end up not putting your sort of effort equally, or in a missed manner. There will be a mismatch in terms of putting too much effort in first part and not putting enough effort in second part. So I know when I read both the parts that I know that I want to talk about the features of demerit goods. I want to talk about why they're overconsumed by showing a diagram, and then in the next part I can talk about indirect taxes and information failure and give a conclusion. That's what I need to do. Okay, so let's start. So first part 3A, which is basically talking about demerit goods. What are demerit goods? What are the features of demerit goods? Number one, there is a negative externality as consumption can affect third party. Remember, the externality is the third party cost or benefit. Example could be cigarettes, where there could be case of passive smoking, where you are harming yourself but you're also harming others because you are consuming, for example, cigarettes. So there is a negative externality. There is also basically what we call information failure. What is the information failure? The benefit happens today, but the cost is incurred tomorrow or later, right? In terms of health issues and so on. So therefore, basically, we may over consume the good. You can also write this in your introduction paragraph. You can talk about very briefly that demerit goods are private goods which have two kinds of problems. Number one, negative externality and information failure. Okay, although private पे इतना ज़्यादा बात करने की ज़रूरत नहीं है, but mentioning it private good doesn't make you lose marks. In fact, the examiner would know that you know that they are private goods. Okay, then we talk about the idea that the demand for cigarettes would be like this. So this is quantity, this is price. You can make it kind of like an inelastic demand curve, and supply should be like this. And let's say the price is right now P naught and Q naught, but the demand, the socially desirable demand, should be D dash. The society should be consuming less of cigarettes. So in this case, this is what we call over consumption. So you write in your answer that D naught is the demand, the current demand, while D dash is what we call socially desirable demand. Why is it socially desirable? Because demand should be less than what it should be. Because the demand is D dash right now, D naught right now, there is a case of overconsumption in the case of your demerit goods, right? Does that make sense? So they're asking us, explain what economists mean when they describe a demerit good. I just did that, and using diagrams show why such goods will be overconsumed. We just did that. Make sense? We did both the parts, right? Because of information failure and negative externality, society should demand less of this good. And we showed the diagram as well. Sorted? Yeah? Let's look at B part. Discuss any two policies that might be used to deal with the problems of consumption caused by consumption. So in the case of demerit goods, we should do what we call either indirect taxes or information or awareness. Okay, so let's talk about indirect taxes. This is where we talk about indirect taxes. So when you look at indirect taxes will do this. Let's draw the diagram for this. Let's say this is my D naught, S naught, price currently is P naught, quantity is Q naught, and you want the demand to be D dash. Okay, how much tax will you put? And the answer is you will have Q1 here. I will extend the line upward all the way here. Okay, guys, and I'm going to sort of say the demand should be, the supply should be S dash. So when you put a tax causing the cost per unit to rise, and the new supply curve will be S dash, which is after tax, and the quantity Q1 will be demanded, that is socially desirable and price will be P, let's call it dash. Does that make sense? Price P dash हो गई. आपने जो आपको quantity चाहिए थी, this was, is the good under over consumed now? Not anymore. Does that make sense? What are the advantages versus disadvantages? So let's write pros and cons. Advantage number 1, uses market forces of demand supply. Good job. Market forces of demand and supply. Number 2, first, tax revenues. Tax revenue for government. Government will be like very happy. And because we know this good is inelastic, tax revenue will be large. Makes sense? Number 3, of course, serves our purpose, right? It will lower the quantity to socially desirable level. Good job. Any other advantage? She said something about tax evasion is not possible. We will say this, that collecting the tax is easy. It's not like a lot of people, whoever buys the good will pay the tax. So tax collection is easy. तीन काफ़ी हैं वैसे तो. What about disadvantages or cons? Pros के साथ cons आते हैं. What about cons? So before that, number one is we don't know how much tax to put. Why do we do not know that? Because we don't know the size of externality. We don't know how much externality is being cost. It's difficult to find the size of externality. We don't know how much tax to put. Number one. Number two is their effectiveness depend on elasticity. If the good is inelastic, we may need to put a much higher tax to get the desired quantity. For example, in the case of cigarettes, because the good is inelastic, we may need to put a large tax. Number three, it is inflationary in nature. If you put a lot of indirect taxes, it is inflationary in nature. Number four, somebody said it's also regressive in nature. The rich and the poor pay the same amount of tax if they're buying the same good. Let's say Sadiq भी वही cigarette पी रहा है, मैं भी वो cigarette पी रहा हूँ. Sadiq student है, zero income, Aliyan Wazada is a teacher at Cedar College, and let's say we both smoke. What brand do we smoke? Marlboro Lights पीते हैं हम लोग. थोड़ा सा reds hard होते हैं. So Marlboro, I'm sorry, I'm recording this, I'm going to delete that. They're like, this teacher is talking about cigarettes and consumption of cigarettes in a recorded. Sorry guys, I don't mean it. So yeah, it's regressive in nature. It's inflationary in nature. Its effectiveness depends on elasticity. Just to go back to the question now. Next part you talk about information. So what about information or awareness? And the answer to this one is basically, when you give information and awareness, you're trying to solve the problems. The pros is basically, one of the problems of demerit goods is that people may not know the true benefit of cost of these goods, and that's why these goods are over consumed. So that's why it's good. What's the con of what's the disadvantage of using this technique? Number one, expensive, because you need to run ads and so on and educate people. Number two could be may take some time to show its result. It's not that I see an ad and I'm quickly convinced that, oh, I need to make sure that I don't smoke anymore, because look, this guy was smoking in front of its kid and the kid is now having whatever effects, if that's right. And number three, it may depend on effectiveness of the marketing or awareness. What if I make a really lousy ad? I may be like, you know what, a stupid ad, I'm going to keep on smoking. You know, in our times when we were growing up, there was a stupid ad that used to come. The guy would be smoking in front with the child and all that, and the child would be like looking at the dad, and the ad was like, you should not be smoking in front of your kids, and you'd be like, it's not helping the cause. Okay, you have to have effective advertising. Well, in the case of this indirect taxes, there is no black market issue. Black market issue, remember this, black market only comes when the good has a shortage. For example, if it's a shortage, like maximum price के case में black market बनती है, because वहाँ पे shortage होती है. If there is no shortage, in this case there will not be a black market. Tax evasion के लिए no, but like people are just like it gets sold in the market. Still there is no black market case. So this question is basically explain using appropriate examples, appropriate diagrams, the meaning of the term externalities. So this is good that now that we've done merit and demerit goods, we know positive and negative externality, or we also know the diagram for externalities where you can show two examples. Positive externality, like for example education, the demand should be more. Negative externality, demand should be less. So you can talk about those. But basically, how do we define externalities? Externalities are basically your third party cost or benefit for which no compensation is paid. Okay, neither you pay a third party any cost, or neither you get paid for any benefit that you give third party, and basically it results in under or over provision. If it's a, and you can give examples of, for example, your merit goods and demerit goods. So you give example of merit goods in education, you can do that, and demerit goods, which are examples of goods which have negative and positive externality, and how then you draw a diagram for this where demand should be more, and in this case you say demand should be less. And you can show those two diagrams that we have drawn earlier for the case of merit and demerit goods and so on.
What question is it?
This question is this one, which says is that explain using appropriate diagrams. Diagrams means two diagrams, the meaning of the term externalities. So we talk about positive externalities and negative externality. Merit goods has what we call positive externalities, positive externality, and demerit goods have what we call a negative sort of externality. And you talk about both the positive and negative externality that happens because of the merit and demerit goods. Got it? The two diagrams, I'm going to quickly show you those two diagrams. It is on the same page. This is the diagram where, forget about the green line, but this is the diagram for the case of merit goods, the demand should be more. For the demerit goods, the demand should be less, something like this. Got it? So you draw the two diagrams here as well, and that's your marks for the question. Examples matter. Give examples of both the goods, draw the diagrams, give the definition, talk about one is under provisioned and another one is over provisioned, and that's why both of these are externalities are market failure, because the quantity is not right. Make sense? Are we good? Is there any question before we move on? Are we good to move on? Okay. Then comes B part. Explain the most appropriate policy the government should adopt when the production of a good gives rise to negative externality. Now, when the production of a good give rise to negative externality, I want to talk about basically what kind of a good can give rise to negative externality because of its production. Yeah, but like demerit goods के case में अगर if you look at cigarettes, if they're not consumed, are they still harmful? Let's say if they're unsold cigarettes lying, are they harmful?
Chemical substance like fertilizer.
Okay. It's,
those dump
so here in this case, this is basically the question that they're saying is basically about production externality. So I'm going to draw the case for production externality. What if there's a producer who's making a good, but at the same time he's dumping waste in the river? Such a producer basically will have this kind of a diagram, guys. This is a producer producing something which is causing a harm to society. So if this is demand and supply, it's not about the demand side of the problem. What if I'm making, for example, tires, but the way I make them, the waste I throw in the river. So where's the problem lying? In the consumption of tires or in the production of tires? Production of tires. Consumption may not be, consumer may not even know that these tires were made in a socially unresponsible manner or irresponsible manner. So supply should be this much. The socially desirable supply should be not S naught but S dash, and therefore the producer is in this case overproducing. This is what we call over provision. Does that make sense? So how do you solve this problem of over provision? Because the producer has produced a good which is not socially desirable quantity, and the answer is you can put indirect taxes, or you can do awareness, or third thing in this case what you could do is basically also we can do, so let me write this, you can do indirect taxes equal to S dash. You can do what we call a regulation, like put a fine on the guy, like a punishment for the fact that you are dumping waste in the river, or you could do what we call awareness, as to let people know that this is not something which is right, and therefore you need to probably recycle or probably throw things in a socially desirable manner. We go back to the question quickly. Discuss the most appropriate policy the government should adopt when the production of a good gives rise to negative externality. What do you guys think should be the most appropriate? Either you need to talk about pros and cons. Indirect taxes ke pros and cons. You need to talk about, for example, awareness ke pros and cons. Because even if I know as a producer, should I follow? I know that I'm dumping waste in the river and it is causing harm to the river. Should I care about it? And the answer is maybe not, because I'm looking at my private interest. So best way that you can go about it is either put a tax or put a regulation. Normally in these cases regulations work well because there is a punishment attached to it. The only problem with regulation is what? Number one, what if the regulation is such that it is too lenient? Let's say you say, okay, I'm going to put a fine of 500 rupees versus I'm going to put such a big fine that you will not be able to operate anymore. That's where it becomes effective. So you talk about first indirect taxes, pros and cons, then talk about regulation. Advantages that one of the advantage of regulation is just that it is easily understood. People know that if you do this, you will be fined. The only problem is this, that in order to make regulation successful, number one, the punishment has to be large enough for people to not do something. B is this, that you need to also then start policing. You need to basically make sure that whoever does the crime gets punished and so on. So there is a cost of policing that happens in regulation. Make sense? And indirect taxes are simply when you know that this producer is doing it, you just put a indirect tax on the bill. Versus regulation may you find somebody has done it and you say, like in order to clean the river, we now need $5 million from you, so you are fined for that. Or you knowing that if you do this, there will be a fine of so much, such a big price, you may not do it in the first place. Okay? Make sense? So that's an answer for this one. Are we good to move on? Most appropriate. When I say most appropriate policy, I need to give a couple of policies before I decide in my conclusion which one you feel is most appropriate. Like if I'm writing an answer, I'm going to give 2-3 policies, at least 2 policies, and then choose regulation over probably taxation. Correct? I may choose regulation over taxation as a conclusion. But your answer could be your answer. You might have a different conclusion. That's okay. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, now I'm moving to the next page. There is the next discussion that we want to have is important discussion, which came in summer of 17. Then basically again 16 we had a question part 2 on demerit goods, and then we look further. We have a discussion on public goods. And now these are the more recent questions. So I'm going to look at, move to the middle page now, which is distinguish between, this one also is easy. Discuss whether subsidies or improved information is the more effective policy with the problems raised by underconsumption of merit goods. In this question, part A is different than part B. So part B, you need to define merit goods. Define merit goods and you need to then talk about why there is underconsumption. Talk about how subsidies can fix it and its pros and cons, and then talk about how improved information is another way to go about it. Give an example. A good example could be polio vaccine, where improved information can be the way to go forward to have a long-term effect, but it takes much longer and so on. So guys, indirect taxes, subsidies पे काफी सवाल आ रहे हैं. We see this, so you got to prepare that really well. Pros and cons of them. Fixing merit and demerit goods is basically a common theme that is seen in the last few years. Okay, am I good to move on? Okay, look at this one now. Explain how habit forming demerit goods with a lot of substitutes are each likely to respond to price changes, and consider the extent to which knowledge of their likely response would be useful to government policymakers. So what is this question asking us? I'm not reading the A part because A part doesn't have much to do with the B part, so that's why. Explain how habit forming demerit goods, because they're habit forming, they could be inelastic in nature. Isn't that true? But they are demerit goods, which means there is an information failure and negative externality. And goods with lots of substitutes, which means these goods are elastic. So एक तरफ आपके पास elastic good है, एक तरफ आपके पास inelastic good है. Okay, and they're saying are each likely to respond to price changes. And यहाँ पे आप बोलोगे एक में, if for the inelastic good, quantity will not change much, but for elastic goods you will have quantity will change much more. And consider the extent to which the knowledge of their likely response would be useful for government policymaker. Now I'm going to move on to talk about what are the kind of things that we can talk about here. From a government perspective, when I look at demerit good, which is inelastic in nature, I can go about by putting a tax. But knowing this, putting a tax will it be good for me or not? And the answer is it won't be effective. So the diagram that I'm going to draw here would be something like this. I'm going to make two goods. One is inelastic, one is elastic. And I say the government decides to put a tax on both the goods. So let's say supply curve right now is S0 and both have let's say the same price P0. Okay? When you put a tax, supply curve will shift to the left. And let's say we try to put the same kind of a tax. And you can say this, that the quantity did not change much or change very little, but the price went up by much more. While in this case the price did not go up too much, but the quantity can change much more. So this is something which I want to show about elastic versus inelastic good. If for example the government decides to put a tax on both the goods, what is the result from a government perspective? How do I solve the problem if I want to lower the quantity for inelastic goods? Here what I'll say is this, put a large tax or rely on other strategies. Like for example, information or awareness. Makes sense that people may not be truly responding to the changes in taxes. While in this case, I know this, that who pays the tax in the first case versus second case? In this inelastic good, who pays the tax? We also know this, that the consumer pays the tax. And either largely producer pays the tax. So you can mention that a point as well, that government may need to decide if they don't want producer to pay the tax, for example, or if they don't want consumer to pay the tax, they need to choose basically elasticity. Knowing if the good is inelastic, consumer will pay most of the tax. So that could be another factor to consider for the demerit goods. Okay, are we good? Any questions before we move on? So this basically is your first part of your discussion. You saw how we've discussed consumer surpluses, producer surpluses. You saw how indirect taxes के effect on consumer surplus, producer surplus. We saw merit, demerit, public and private good की distinction आपको बहुत अच्छी तरह पता होनी चाहिए. मेरी gut feel ये कहती है सवाल इस पे एक आएगा from what we've discussed in this part. The second part, which comes also a lot often, is your elasticity, which is my second file, which is what I'm going to discuss in 5 minutes. But is there any question before we move on? No? Okay. Now, the way we'll do this worksheet is basically we will look at all the common questions. Rather than doing each question, we'll look at basically kaun se important topic, and we'll try to sort of do those important topics, okay? So our goal will be to basically do important topics, and these are the last 5 years, and you'll understand last 5 years mein how the examiner has gone about testing and what are the things you need to focus on. Okay, so let's start. If you look at this is something which need to understand that winter 17 we had a question about merit and demerit goods. Then if you go look upward, you would again there is a question number 2 here, which was on merit and public goods. So clearly merit and public goods is another. I'm going to move to this page, last page. 17, which is an 18. Let's look at 18 first. 2A, explain why both merit goods and demerit goods are example of private goods. We know the answer. Discuss whether merit goods and demerit goods are best provided by market economy. Then we talk about, in the case of merit goods, there is under provision. In the case of demerit goods, there is over provision. Both of them have a market failure, and therefore they are not provided rightly in a market economy where market forces of demand and supply are allocating resources. Then we talk about how do we fix the problem as well. How do we fix the problem for merit goods? You can subsidize the good, you can give more information. How do you fix the problem of demerit goods? You can tax or you can give more information. And then you can conclude by saying this, that giving more information is probably the best way to deal with merit and demerit goods when the market is unable to provide the right quantity. Okay? So this is same discussion here. Discuss how the imposition of an indirect tax on a product will affect consumers, the government and producers. Assess whether it will have an overall beneficial effect. So let's look at how indirect tax work because a lot of questions are on indirect tax. So this is the question which is a detailed question on indirect tax. So the way we're going to go about this one is this, that not only I'm going to show you indirect taxes, but I'm going to show you consumer surplus, producer surplus before and after. And we talk about how consumers get affected, how producers get affected. We'll talk about tax burden in this case. Who pays the tax depends on elasticity. We'll also talk about why government will be happy when there is indirect taxes in terms of tax revenue. Okay, so let's draw a diagram for indirect taxes. First we define indirect taxes, which is basically a tax on expenditure, right? What does it do? Cost of production will go up, supply will fall, causing the price to rise. And then we will make a diagram for indirect taxes. The one diagram that I'm going to make here is the one which has both consumer surplus, producer surplus before and after. So this is the diagram that we need to make here. So price is P naught, quantity is Q naught. When I put a tax on this good, supply curve will shift backward. Okay, now the new price is P1 and the quantity is, for example, Q1. Let's label this as area 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And let's call this P2. Okay? Before when the price is P naught and the quantity is Q naught, so before basically tax, my consumer surplus will be, price is P naught, quantity is Q naught, so consumer surplus is 1 plus 2 plus 3. Yeah, and producer surplus क्या होगा? 4 plus 5 plus 6. Yeah, do you all agree? Area under the demand curve above the market price. Area under the market price above the supply curve is my producer surplus. Got it? Then we talk about after tax. Price is P naught, price is P1, quantity is Q1. Consumer surplus will be 1. Producer surplus will be, no, mera bacha, 6 only. This is what producer is getting. Because amount, remember guys, if the price is $10 and if the price now is 12, this vertical distance AB is the amount of tax. So ye 12 minus, let's say if the tax was $4, then 12 minus 4 is equal to 8. Producer got 12 from the consumer, but he gave the government $4 and he ended up with $8. So consumer surplus will be 1, producer surplus will be 6, and tax revenue will be 2 plus 5. And what is 3 plus 4? Shabash. 3 plus 4 will be what we call our deadweight loss. Do you guys get it? So the idea goes, now we can, once we've done this discussion, we can have once we've drawn this diagram, we can have a good discussion about basically who's benefiting, who's losing out. So consumers, do they lose out or do they win? Consumer lose out in terms of, let me write this now. Consumers, higher prices, lower quantity, and lower consumer surplus. What about producers? Producers, lower sort of revenue and also lower producer surplus. What about government? Government will gain in terms of, exactly, so government will say gain in terms of tax revenue. And what about, who else was there? Yeah, then we talk about the idea that who pays the tax will depend on what? Elasticity. We'll say this, that the burden of taxation depends on PED, and we can talk about the idea that the lower the elasticity or lower the PED, higher will be the consumer burden. In reality, by the way, it depends on PED and PES. If PED is less than PES, then consumer pays more burden than the producer. Make sense? Are we good? Any question before we move on? Okay, I want to go back to the question quickly just to sum it up. Give me 1 minute, guys. Look at this. So, assess whether it will have an overall beneficial effect. Is there any way we can make an argument for taxes? What's the benefit of indirect taxes if you're putting it? What if the good is a demerit goods? In the case of demerit goods, I can make an argument that taxes can be desirable. they can be desirable. Right? So we can talk about how if the good is indirect, if the good is a demerit good, then it is desirable because it lowers the quantity. The consumers may not know the true harm of the good, and it may end up causing the society to benefit. However, the effectiveness of this will depend on basically the right amount of the tax. What if the government ends up undertaxing? And number two, the effectiveness of it depend on elasticity. If the good is very inelastic, then people may not cut down quantity too much. Okay, this could be my conclusion in this question. Okay, so with this came in Winter 17 variant 1, which means it's a pretty recent question as well. Okay, are we good? Let's look at this one. 2A is easy. We've already done 2A. This came in summer 17. So काफी repeat हो चुका है सवाल. Difference between merit and public goods. Discuss whether it is better to impose indirect taxes or conduct. We also know the answer for this one. Yeah, are we happy with this question as well? B part is also easy, which is basically pros and cons of indirect taxes, and talk about awareness and talk about which one do you feel is more appropriate. And your answer should be probably giving awareness is more appropriate. However, long term, it doesn't really have a quick effect. Number two, it can be expensive. And number three, the awareness campaign may require the message to be effective in order to see the desired result. So you can talk about that as your answer. Are we good? Is that fine? Okay.